Hi, my name is Wendi Jensen, and I want to share my story with you. I hear stories every day of people who have gone through the trauma of leaving their high demand religion and the impact that it has on their family and the impact that it has on their psyche and their well being and their health. And I forget that I haven't shared my story. I haven't gone public. Well, I have gone public, but never created a video about my own story and my own journey. And so I want to share with you why it is that I am so passionate about um, helping people to gain the skills to get to harvest all of the potential wisdom and knowledge and maturity that's available in having a faith crisis. When we're in the middle of it, it just feels like it's just going to be like this forever. We don't know what to expect at the other end. Nobody told us this was going to happen. We weren't expecting it. We think something is wrong with us. In reality, we are just emerging beings. We are growing and we are evolving. And in this generation, at this time in history, there is an outflux of people leaving religion because the old ways of doing things and getting us to be benevolent and kind, the guilt and the shame and the fear and the obligation, they're not working for us anymore. And so it's almost like religion is phasing out and we are finding new ways to harmonize with each other and to grow together in healthy ways that don't include the stories and the mythology of religion. It served its purpose. The problem is when you have been raised in, or when you have converted to a religion that was really, really true to you and very much real, and you were living it the very best you knew how. When that happens, and you then have a faith crisis, and you go into the transitional phase, it can be very disturbing to your well-being. And so this is what we're experiencing in our day and age. And I think it's an onset or a result of the onset of the internet and the information age and this age of transparency that we're experiencing. So I want to share with you my story and why I do what I do. And before I begin, I want to let you know that my story is not going to be the same as anybody else's. It's different, and your story is different. The reasons why people leave high demand religion, they're a multiplicity of reasons. This is just my story, and this is what made what we call my shelf. It made my shelf break. When I talk about shelf, I'm talking about the ideas that aren't resonating with you, that you don't understand, that you tend to put on the shelf because you don't have enough information to make a decision until finally that shelf breaks and you make a decision that will change your life forever. The life you knew before that decision will not look anything like the life that you will be creating afterward. And it's an epic moment in your life. So here's my story. I was raised probably a 7th generation LDS or Mormon and Latter-day Saint. And my ancestors helped build many of the temples, including the very first temples. And we crossed the plains. We have stories of our pioneer heritage. My ancestors were some of the martyrs, the first martyrs of the mobs after the Smith brothers were murdered. And so that was in my blood, and we were very dedicated to our faith and our religion. I grew up very devout. My dad had become a bishop when I was about 16, I believe. No, I probably was a little bit younger than that, but right there in my teen years. And so there was very much expected of me as his daughter to be an example. And I tried to do my best. I have a pleasing personality, so I wanted to please my parents. I wanted to please my authorities. I wanted to please my teachers and my leaders and my bishop and my stake president. I wanted everybody to be proud of me. I needed people to know that I was a good person. And so I toed the line, and I didn't drink, I didn't have sex, I didn't do any of the normal things that teenagers do. I wasn't a teenager for very long because I got married at 18. I tried out for BYU dance team and I didn't make it, so it was plan B, and that was find a worthy priesthood holder and get married. And so I started dating soon after I turned 18. And within 4 months, I was married to my husband in the temple for what I thought would be for all time and eternity. And we began our family very soon after that. And within 10 years, I had 5 children and I had 2 miscarriages. So I was very much entrenched in being a mother and very much left without very many skills to be a mom, to raise children, or to have a relationship. I didn't understand any of those things. I didn't learn it at church. I didn't learn it at school. And so I was very much winging it. I didn't understand. So by the time I had my 5 children, and the youngest was about 2, I went into some personal development, looking for answers and solutions for my dysfunctional marriage. And what I realized is that I had a high level of perfectionism that was so paralyzing and so gripping for me. And I know the day that it all locked in. I've always been an overachiever, but it wasn't until the first moment that I nursed my first baby. And as I had her at my breast, I was looking into her eyes and we were having this cosmic experience together. It's almost like at the same time, the doctrine downloaded onto me. And I realized that if I misstepped and that if I wasn't the daughter or the mother that I needed to be for this child, I could risk losing her in the next life. Because in the next life, if you do not live the covenant path, then you'll be separated from your family in the next life. And so our whole goal as parents was to teach our children in a way that they would never want to deviate from that path. And the consequences of deviating from that path means that they wouldn't be with me in the next life. And that was not an option for me. I was so in love with this little baby. I wasn't going to let anything happen. And so that's when I became a mom with her hair on fire. And I went to the extent of I was going to homeschool. I was going to encase them in this environment. There was no possible way that they could make a choice that would possibly cause them to not be with me in the next life. And of course, those high expectations were also expected onto my poor husband. And I expected him to be the priesthood holder, the ideal priesthood holder. I expected him to at least make the same amount of ridiculous effort that I was making. And it made for a really toxic marriage. He never felt sufficient. Of course he didn't. I never felt sufficient. I always felt that no matter how much I tried, I was never going to be good enough to qualify for the highest degrees of the kingdom, which is the only place where you can be with your family in the next life. You see, Mormonism teaches that they have the power to seal families in the next life, but they don't tell you that if you don't obey all the commandments and meet the requirements of the covenant path, that you will be separated. Now, I think it's interesting how I understand how religion kind of does that. It's a very unkind and unloving God to expect all of his children to conform to one religion or be separated in the next life. That to me just makes no sense now. And so I realized that they created the bad news, that you'll be separated in the next life, so that they could create the good news, which means that only through us can you return back together and be together. Sorry about that. So I was living this life trying to do everything that I knew how, and I went into self-development and into the healing arts, and I learned about the depth of my perfectionism, and I started the journey of trying to understand me and how I had situated in myself in the world so rigidly and so black and white. But during this experience, it took me many years to come to the point where I understood the power and the depth to which the mind operates, and how we think and how we feels in the body, and how it affects the body, and not just how it affects the body, but how it affects our external world and of course our relationships. And so through my studies and through my research and through my training and through my licensing through rapid eye technology and emotional freedom technique and other healing modalities, I started to write a book. It was kind of like what I would call my research paper. My little dog is getting excited about this. And it is a 500, now it turned into a 500-page resource book for healers. And what it is basically my research of discovering mind viruses, thoughts and beliefs that we have in the mind that contribute to what the sickness is going on in the body. And by the time I'd completed that 3-year project, I had come to the conclusion that most of the things that we believe about ourselves is some kind of radical contempt against the self. And so I started to ask other questions like, what is the core belief that we established that creates such contempt against the self? And immediately my mind went to the thought of me being such a sinner, or such a broken person, or somebody who has crossed through the veil, that whatever I had done or what I will do required a redemptive offering by one of the most loving of us, one of the most undeserving of cruelty, for him to die a violent death to pay for something I did or something I will do. And so just that idea right there, when you're very young, you're showed pictures of Jesus Christ on the cross, and you're showed blood, you're showing his flesh being pierced with nails. It's the most traumatizing images you can imagine. And it was done for you. And so it becomes very confusing in the mind that there's something so vile about me that it required that for me to get back to God. And how else do I get back to God? I have to live this perfect life. You see, in Mormonism, we don't talk about grace. We see Christianity totally different. And so this is how it had been ordered in my mind. And so any imperfection or any perceived imperfection was yet another mark to validate that I am not worthy and that I'm ashamed of myself. And it begins to develop that contempt against the self. So I could go into this forever, but I need to get on with my story. By the end of this book, and by asking those deep questions, that's the place where my mind was. I could somehow play some mental gymnastics to justify Mormonism in every other area, but this is where my entry point was. And that is the power of the mind and that contaminated idea about who I was at the core. So my level of membership was that I was a gospel doctrine teacher. I taught for 8 years as gospel doctrine teacher, which is one of the highest instructional teaching positions in the LDS Church, because I wanted to know the doctrine, I wanted to live it, I wanted to qualify it. And I was passionate about it. And I do my research and my work. So I knew the theology, I knew the history that I was allowed to study. I knew it, but like the back of my hand. I had read all of these things. I had taught them. Each class I had taught at least twice. So I was very much entrenched. And when I came to this conclusion that what about this belief, that's where I started asking deep, heavy questions. And at the same time, there was some fiasco going down in the polygamous land, I guess you would call it, with the FLDS community, where they were, arresting Warren Jeffs, and he had been exposed for some of the things that he was doing, and they were making sure that the compound community were safe by extracting the children away from the environment until they could assess and make sure it was a safe environment for the children, which as a mother, I would be devastated. So they were interviewing some of the mothers, and I was watching this on television, and as I watched them interview the mothers, it shook me awake, because I could see the vacancy in their eyes. I could see that their vocabulary was very limited and controlled. What I couldn't see was emotion, like their emotions have been completely numbed out, and they were not emotional about the fact that their children had been taken away from them at this time. They dressed the same, their hair looked the same. And it just fascinated me that they were almost robotic or automatons that had no identity of their own. And I thought, but these are mothers with children. How could they be so removed from their children as to not be passionate and upset and concerned about this? And that's when I went into discovering cult dynamics. and I started studying cults. I started studying the characteristics of cult leaders, and it became very fascinating for me. And then I bumped into what is called the BITE model. BITE is an acronym for what cults do to control your behavior, your information, your thoughts, and your emotions. And when I went through that BITE model, it was like my whole world woke up, and I realized that I too had been raised in a cult, and that the LDS Church was absolutely practicing all the unhealthy, undue influence that is found in cults. Now, I had been told we lived in a cult, and I was raised in a cult, but I never believed that. I thought that's ridiculous. Of course I'm not. And now I understand that the only people who don't know they're in a cult are the people inside the cult. And it takes very much for them to be able to wake up to that, because they are so entranced with the doctrine and all of the fear and mind control that surrounds and encases that doctrine, that causes them not to look outside of it. And now that I understood this, I realized that I was raised in a cult. And it was hard for me to accept for a minute. But afterwards, it was almost like this flood of relief came over me. Relief that I did not have to live by this standard of expectation, and that all this doctrine had been something that had been imposed on me, and all the other questions I had about polygamy and racism and sexism and all of those things that I had somehow been able to justify, it all came collapsing. And what a sense of relief that was for me. I was so relieved to know that none of that was true, that it was such a tightly gripping theology that had kept my mind so wrapped and entranced in it that I couldn't find my way out. And that moment felt so relieving. And I felt so much love for myself and what I had been through. And I started to see everybody differently. And it's such a surreal moment, that moment when you say, it's not true. It's not true. But that moment is very fleeting, because now you're going to have to deal with all the fallout that comes when you try to leave a high demand religion. And that fallout is intense. But at that point, that was the first time that I gave myself permission to study the history outside of the approved and controlled curriculum. And I learned more about Joseph Smith, that he wasn't the benevolent and virtuous man that I had been taught that he was. He wasn't the man that was portrayed in all the movies. In fact, from what I knew about Christ and his mission, he did not even anywhere fit within a possible protege for Jesus Christ. His theology was very ego-based, whereas Christ is not ego-based. He was pursuing all these positions and powers, and when I went to the temple, all I could then hear in the temple was how the temple was ego-based, and how it was fear-oriented, and how it was so much entrenched in this need to control. And it's just like everything started to have its new language. My eyes were open and I could see it. And I would go to church and I would hear the manipulation going on by people who didn't know they were manipulating. And that is crazy making. And I noticed all this things started frustrating me. I brought this information to my brother, who was in the stake presidency at the time. And I tried to bring at least some of the problems I was having to him. I didn't want to dump him with and burden him with all the problems I was having. But I noticed he didn't have any answers for me. I noticed and I knew if he did have answers for me, he would have given them to me, because he saw that I was having what was real turmoil going on for me. And I trusted him, and I trusted his wife, who was my best friend. And she gave me the best counsel at that time. She says, Wendi, maybe you just need to take a break from the church. And I don't think she realizes that, and I don't think she's proud of it or even maybe wants to know. But that was the moment where I gave myself permission to stop going every Sunday and get indoctrinated every week. And I took a breath, and I could stand away and breathe my own air and think my own thoughts and get away from the indoctrination and then from the cultural environment and just think about it for myself. And during that time, I did a lot of studying and a lot of praying and a lot of research, because I knew that if what this conclusion I had come to, that it's not true, if that is true, then there's a lot that's going to be a problem in my life, because I had raised my kids in the church. My spouse was, he was in the church. Um, my family, all of them were in the church. And all my business at that time of my coaching and my healing arts was only with LDS women. And so I knew that if once I came out and revealed that I was no longer going to be a temple recommend holding healer, that's the reason they came to me, because they were hoping that I would operate within the confines and the periphery of the church. And so it would be a sad day for me. So I had to know that these thoughts and feelings that I was having were real and true. And what I learned at that moment is that truth is not all peace. The truth, when you learn truth, it's not all flowers and good feelings and these just feelings of peace waves of peace that roll over us. No, the truth is disturbing. The truth is uncomfortable many times. And yes, it did bring peace in the beginning, but unpacking and unraveling my religion, I felt would be like pulling the string of a grand tapestry that I had been creating. If I pulled the string called religion, that I would come undone, because my identity had been so woven into the religion that I was afraid that I wouldn't exist. I was convinced the only reason I was good is because I was Mormon. The only reason I had any intuitive gift was because I had the Holy Ghost. And I was afraid I was going to lose my family, my greatest fear, and why I had become so rigidly oriented in the first place. And so I had to do some serious work. And the work that we do is a very lonely process, especially if you don't have a spouse who's going through the same process with you. Luckily for me, my husband at the time, he was also going through a faith crisis for completely different reasons. And we were able to communicate with each other our feelings. I'm so grateful for that, because now that I have left and I've been coaching people who are leaving, I see the pain and the struggle they go through when a spouse is still believing and they're trying to unpack all of these things while the spouse is still holding tight to the church. And so I feel very fortunate at that. So I have my notes up here, which is why I'm looking up here. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. What I realized is in the church there's just this polarization that limits our growth and development. And it's not until we leave that we realize how underdeveloped we are. You see, in the doctrines there's what's called polarization. That means on two ends of the spectrums, there's two things going on. So you're taught that you're loved by God and that you are just so precious and so special, that you're a daughter of God. I was taught that my whole life. But here on the other end, I'm also taught that I am a sinner and that I'm in need of continual repentance, and that I have to go into worthiness interviews every 6 months when I'm a youth and every 2 years when I'm an adult, so that I can prove that I'm worthy to enter the house of the Lord, and that through my actions would prove my worthiness. And so I'm constantly in this debate of, I'm a daughter of God. Am I worthy enough? I'm a daughter of God and I'm loved. And maybe I haven't done enough. And it doesn't allow for growth and development to go on, because your growth is polarized. It's like you become paralyzed. Other things that are polarized is like tithing. You're taught that if you pay your tithing, that you will have sufficient for your needs. And some people believe that the reason that there are wealthy LDS people is because they pay their tithing. But they can't make the logical sense that there are wealthy people who don't pay their tithing. And we also know that people who don't have wealth are paying their tithing generously, and they seem to struggle. And so we're starting to realize that the financial law has nothing to do with tithing. It has to do with education, and it has to do with you creating something that's beneficial and contributive to commerce. So we're not able to develop beyond that. We learn about the word of wisdom, that if you don't drink alcohol or tea or coffee, and if you don't do drugs, then you will run fast and not be weary, walk and not faint. But on the other hand, we aren't taught about sugars and volume, and we're not taught about the real laws of nutrition. And so we don't progress in that area, and we're wondering, oh, what's wrong with me? I'm not healthy, and I'm not drinking alcohol, I'm not doing drugs. It just leaves us in this very infantile state of development because we don't make the necessary education. And what's interesting is, as I tell you these things, especially the younger generation, you're going to say they don't teach it. They don't teach that stuff anymore. You're exaggerating. Well, I'm going to let you know that what you're being taught today is very different than what I was taught and what was indoctrinated to me as a young person. And so people my age believe a lot differently than you do because those things were ingrained in us. And so they were rigid, and we can't just unpack it all and just suddenly say, oh, that's not what we taught, because those were taught to us as relevant doctrines. So I know things are changing, which I think is a good thing. However, you can't not underestimate the damage it does to us older generation who was brought through with such rigidity. So that polarization also happened with the fact that I was taught that I had something special. I have the Holy Ghost. I have I'm a member of the only true church. And if I follow the only prophet that is authorized to speak for Jesus Christ, that I will be happy. And I was doing everything I could in that area, and I was not happy. And my family definitely looked like the picture perfect family, 5 children sitting on the pew, clean and beautiful, and pretending like our world is so fabulous and beautiful. I was taught how to look the part, how to sound the part. And but the dysfunction in our home and in most LDS homes is very silent, and we really don't talk about it, and we pretend like it's not going on, and we pretend like it's less than the rest of the world. And that, I understand now, is just not the truth. So this idea that I was superior to the rest of the world because I had the gospel of Jesus Christ and they didn't, but yet I also feel inferior because I feel like I'm never going to live up to the expectations that God had for me. And so that creates another polarization. So I began to study Joseph Smith without the approved doctrine and realized that he was always giving excuses that he didn't need to be a perfect man. And what I realized that he wasn't even a decent man, and that he didn't even live with the level of decency that I was expected to live by, that in fact, he was manipulating young women to marry him and to appease his sexual desires, and that he was very manipulative, and that there were reasons for him being imprisoned that I was not taught. And of course, it's obvious he was upsetting the fathers in his community, and that those were the people who were creating the lynch mobs. It's because they were concerned about the welfare of their family, their daughters, and their wives. And so we have all this hidden background. We have all this suppressed information. We don't realize there were 9 versions of the first vision, but there was only one that was extracted that seemed to be most beneficial for the church, and that became the one and only. We were not, we're not taught about the old doctrines that were given by Brigham Young and some of the other very racist prophets, and we just tried to scrub those out as if they don't matter, because we're also taught at the same time that a prophet of the Lord will not lead the people astray. But yet over here we see them leading people astray over and over again, and it doesn't add up for me. And what happened for me with the Book of Mormon is when I realized that the character of Joseph Smith was not what it was purported to be, when I realized that the translation of the Book of Abraham was not a direct translation, it was actually a funerary text, and that it was something that was contrived by Joseph Smith, then you apply that same integrity that we learned there to the Book of Mormon, and we realize that for me, it was very difficult for me to believe that if he had somehow manufactured the Book of Abraham through those funerary texts, that he probably manufactured the Book of Mormon. It's especially difficult to believe that now that we have the algorithmic patterns available to us through computer technology, that Book of Mormon looks far more like a remix of about 5 different spiritual texts that were available to Joseph Smith, including the Bible, the King James Version of the Bible, that was more of an amalgamation of those things than it could possibly be an unearthed metal historical volume of plates that were translated with a stone in a hat, and then magically they were swallowed up into the earth after it was done. It's hard for me to buy that story and ask me to just have faith that that's true when the character of Joseph Smith is not only the character of a cult leader, but a classic cult leader with a classic cult leader patterns. And I can't impose any patterns on any other cult leader and recognize those patterns and not make Joseph Smith just as accountable and say, but it doesn't apply to my prophet. And so it just became unreasonable for me. So I also realized that with Jesus Christ, he was always on the precipice of social justice. That's why he was punished the way that as the story goes, that's why he was punished on the cross, is because he was moving past the social justice that was in place at the time. We needed to forgive the adulteress, that we needed to, the things that he was teaching were so full of social justice that the community wasn't ready to live by, that it disturbed that community. He was a radical insurrectionist. And when I look at the pattern of the LDS Church, they are always the last ones to the plate of social justice, not the first. They are the last ones to buy in and say, okay, I guess LGBTQ people were born that way and they have the right to practice intimacy in whatever moral way feels right for them. They're the last to the table about racism. They're the last to the table about making women equal. And so that's not the pattern of Jesus Christ. And so all of these things caused my shelf to break and the blinders came off. And I realized that the information that had been given to me had been controlled. And I have been taught not to study things that were outside of doctrine, as if, as a 45-year-old woman at the time, I didn't have the capacity or propensity to be able to know for myself between truth and error. That I didn't have the research capacity to be able to tell when a document was biased, or when they, had a chip on their shoulder, or I wasn't able to discern between fact and fiction, and that I just needed to stay away from that. The information that I was being exposed to was very much under control, and no organization, the only reason an organization would want to control the information that is given to their people is because they have something to hide. And I have definitely discovered that the LDS Church has a lot to hide, and that they are constantly in the battle of keeping their people under some false pretense. So let me think if I had anything else here. I realized after I had taken a little sabbatical from church that I went back to church. Only then was I able to feel the substance of shame, the legitimate atmosphere of the room in the Relief Society when we went in as women to meet together and have a lesson. I could literally feel the shame that I had been raised in, shame that I didn't recognize because I thought it was so natural. But after I had been learning more about myself and processing all these things, it's like the shame was so thick that it was hard to stay in the room for the entire hour. And I realized my heart was breaking for these women who were under this shame and had no idea how much shame they were under. And I also realized as I left again that I felt so underdeveloped, that there were just things in my life that I didn't know about, and things, skills that I hadn't learned, and that I had this passive aggressive nature that was in my conditioning, and that I was a pleaser, and that I was so afraid. Afraid of disappointing God, afraid of disappointing my authorities, afraid of losing my family the most. And when I let all that go, remember the day that I took off my temple garments and I said, these are not required for me to live a joyful, moral life. I had studied everything about Freemasonry, and I understood that yet again, Joseph Smith had taken what goes on with the Freemasons, and he had replicated it into the Mormon temple. He was a master remixer and taking authority for all of those things. And so the temple had lost value for me. And that was the day that I started to feel so much more freer. And I started to recognize me. I started to feel a little bit more sexier because I lost all my desire to be sexy, and those garments made me feel so trumpy and ugly. And so I was so happy to take those off and to be able to be a free soul to choose my underwear even, but even how I spent my time on Sunday, to choose how I was going to raise my family, not be afraid if I missed family home evening, that I was going to lose my family in the next life. And so I realized that I had been underdeveloped. And what's interesting is I had been working in the field of human development and the healing arts. I had learned about emotional processing. I had written a research book and a healer's resource about emotional wellness, about belief systems, about understanding how what's going on in your mind affects your outer world and your physical body. I had a tool bag of amazing skills. I have always been passionate about what I do, and I'm very good at it. And so as I was walking away from the church, ready to just toss it all behind me and look forward, not have to worry, I took a glance back, spiritually thinking, metaphorically. I took a glance back, and I see at the exit gate of the church so many people coming out who didn't have those skills. They hadn't been doing the training that I had been doing. And it's almost as if on the outside of the church, we are all hemorrhaging and we're bleeding out and we are wounded and we're going to each other, trying to nurse each other's wounds and perform triage when we ourselves are still bleeding out. And that's the community that I'm thankful for. I didn't know I was going to get emotional. But that is tender to me. Just because we leave church does not mean that we lose our connection to what is true and what is moral. And we don't lose community when we leave the church. We band together, we help each other, we reform another community to be there. And I think that's super unique to Mormonism. For people who leave other religions, they don't have that tight-knit community. They don't have the resources that have developed because people feel dedicated to helping each other. And I will ever be grateful that I was raised, that those were the good things that I was raised in the church. And there are many good things: honesty, integrity, hard work, service. All those are a part of me that I will take with me. But you know what? They're not exclusive to Mormonism. They're exclusive to being humane and to having compassion. And I learned that in my church experience. So I get to take that with me. And for those things, I am grateful for that. So I look back at the exit gate and I realize that I have some skills that I can offer to other people who are not sure about the process of leaving the church and all the complexity and all the dynamics that are involved from having your worldview ripped out from underneath you, and the effects of that, of relationship dynamics, of losing your identity alone. It's very intense. So the thing that I learned is that I had been living in a bubble even within the church, and that I was like the picture perfect Mormon woman. And as I leave and I start coaching people, they have deep problems. Like you have the LGBTQ community. I never had to deal with that. They have the single women. I was never a single mom, and understanding what it feels like to be in the church as a single woman, that was invisible to me inside the church, even though she's probably sitting right next to me in Relief Society. I started to see the damage it does to mixed faith marriages. I saw what it does for children, for a parent to no longer believe and they still want to participate and be involved. And the parent feeling guilty because they want to take them away from their community. I was seeing, recognizing that I had been living in a bubble and very insensitive and not very empathetic to the suffering that was going on in my own church and what it feels like, until I was not worthy because I no longer believed for my temple recommend. And then my daughter got married and she wanted to get married in the temple and I couldn't go. And that was the first time I realized how this doctrine that's imposed on us is not healthy for families. It's destructive for families. Some of the things that I teach in my courses is how to regain our personal authority. We're always deferring our authority. We're conditioned to defer our authority to someone else, and we're not even quite sure how it feels to be fully in charge of our choices and to be able to be that sovereign authority in our life and to reclaim that back. That's something so foreign to us. Many women, when they leave and you ask them what it is they want to do, they can't tell you what they want to do because they were conditioned to do whatever it was the church wanted them to do. They don't know who they want to be because they had spent their whole life becoming what the church wanted them to be. So I also learned that my intuition had been hacked, that my ability to know my gut instincts had been contaminated with this idea that anything that was intuitive to me that was outside the periphery of the doctrine couldn't possibly be, because it had to fit within the confines of the doctrine and the brethren. And now my intuition, I had to get reconnected with it, because I was also taught that there is no reason for anybody to leave the church, that if they leave the church, it's because they're deceived, they become too proud, they want to sin, or they become lazy. The church wants to control the narrative. And if they can control the narrative, then people don't ask you why you left. They don't want to know your story. They want to hold tight to the narrative the church gives, that there's no good and ethical reason for you to leave the church other than these 4 or 5 reasons. And so I recognized that my intuition had been tampered with. That at the time where I decided the church wasn't true, my intuition was at a peak level. I was using my gut instincts, my mind, and my heart to make a choice that was even against my own ego. And people say that you're on an ego trip when you leave the church. They don't understand the ego, because the ego wants to keep you safe. And when you leave the church, you risk losing everything. So it's not an ego trip. That is when you are at the height of intuition and you don't realize it because your world is falling apart, so you can be the authority of recreating the world that feels more congruent and more authentic for you. So another thing that I realized is that I was so much into pleasing others, and I kind of already talked about that, but I didn't realize how suppressed I was as a woman and how much I had been conditioned to be such, to allow men to have, rule over me and to give them so much power and attention and so much privilege and authority over me. And I didn't know what it feels like to just be me and to be sufficient in myself. And so there were so many different things that I learned that had affected my own psyche that I didn't know. That here I was thinking, okay, I'm leaving, I have all these skills. I didn't realize that it was going to be another 2 years before I had come out to breathe clean air myself. And in this place, I have learned so much, and being able to coach other people, I have learned so much. So what I've learned is the further I get away from the church, the crazier it looks. The more I give myself opportunity to believe it's not the one and only true church, the more I can see the truth of what's going on And I think it's insidious. And it feels like I'm the one that sounds crazy. And I realize that. But there comes a time in your life when you have to be willing to hurt other people. You have to be willing to disappoint other people. And you have to be willing to risk relationships. You have to have the courage at some point to stop betraying yourself and stop betraying your conscience and be willing to do whatever it takes to become congruent with what it is you know is true. And you have that right, and it is your prerogative to do that. And it is a big transition. And so I'm looking at my notes here. For I'm part of a cultural revolution that is happening to eradicate traditions that hurt families, that hurt people, that put the mind under control, that is not healthy and not growth effective, that don't allow us to grow. And so I realize that we are coming to this place where we no longer need religion that uses these manipulative tools of fear and shame and obligation and guilt. And we're moving into this place where we can be compassionate and honor diversity and not see diversity as a threat, where we can catch a vision of what a more idyllic community looks like, where we can be vulnerable and transparent, and that there are new tools that evolving for us that are leaving religion behind, that are spiritual tools, tapping into our intuition, recognizing that our own compass and our own inner guidance system is there, and it may lead us on paths that we didn't understand or that we could not have foreseen. I could not foresee me being here talking to you about what I'm talking to you today. So I have created some online courses. I do live coaching, private coaching. I have some books out, and I have my website, and I am on stages speaking about this evolution, this personal emergence, and how we can best and most gracefully go through an awkward moment in our life where we rebirth ourselves into something that feels true for us, and that we can use all of the trauma, all of the lessons that were in our first life, and that we can use them and kind of glean the wisdom from them to be kind of the backdrop for a new life that we create, one that feels true for us, one that feels in integrity with who we are at the core. And there are 5 stages I'm going to go through really quickly about this transition. The first one is fear, or doubt. I'm sorry, we begin to have doubts about what we've been taught and whether or not it's true. The second one is we go through fear. Fear that if what we're feeling and what we're reading and what we're studying and what's going on for us is true, that we're going to lose everything and we're not sure what's going to happen to us. And so we go into that state of fear. The third phase is anger. And this phase, I call it more of an emotional phase, because it's not just anger, it's also grief. We grieve what we're losing. And we're angry that we feel betrayed. And most of us don't get past this stage of anger and grief. And we don't know how to process it because nobody has taught us. But we're in a world where there are now tools where we understand how to use emotion rather than resist it and ignore it and suppress it into our body. And so that is the point where I catch someone and teach them the skills. What happens is it's not enough to wake up out of Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness or whatever high demand religion you were in. It's not enough just to wake up out of it and see that it's wrong. You must also grow up with new tools, clean up, understand your past and why you think and feel the way you do, so that you can show up and start making a difference in the world that you are uniquely designed to make. And so that stage 3 is a crucial time. After stage 3, if you're lucky enough to get to stage 3 and you're willing to invest in yourself and gain those skills in stage 3, you move into stage 4. And stage 4 is self-knowing. It's a discovery. You get vitally interested in who you are and what it is you love and what it is you've come here to do. And after you go through this stage of self-knowing, which could be even years, because you're developing new skills and new passions that you've never given yourself permission to express, then we move into stage 5, which is self-acceptance. And at a stage of self-acceptance, there's no more feelings of insecurity. There's no more feelings of superiority. There's no more feelings of inferiority. You feel that you are acceptable. You feel that you are connected. You feel like you're part of the whole. And in this place, you feel powerful. And that power is coming from you. And it's not coming from any external force with you needing validation from some external force. That all that energy is coming from within. And it is a self-sustaining, clean, renewable energy system, because you are a bioelectromagnetic instrument that is designed to sustain that energy on your own. And when you let go of the emotional things and the emotional baggage that have held you down for so long, you become free inside and you become free on the outside. And you become a beautiful and a gorgeous and a happy, truly happy human being. I hope this was helpful for you. If you want to get connected, you can go to wendijensen.com. I'll leave some links below. I love to hear your story too, and I hope that my story was helpful for you. Good luck, all you travelers. Bye.